The big news, which I've tried to explain to all my good friends. Obviously, if you're in the wrestling community, a bombshell was dropped on the entire United States, and Oklahoma
You might want
State.
a different wording.
Oh yeah. Ooh. Wow. God.
Subject.
Good job, Eddie Money, pointing that out. Okay. Just
Big news happened in the wrestling world.
Big news. This is something that is like, if you want to put it this way, this is something that is going to change the direction of collegiate wrestling. This is something that is moving the needle. I mean, if you look at Flow Wrestling's numbers on their posts and reels, it's off the charts. I mean, 30,000 likes and, thousands of comments. This is something that has rocked the wrestling world. What we're talking about is John Smith, maybe the greatest wrestler in American history, the godfather of wrestling, has finally retired. And Oklahoma State went out of the family tree and hired maybe the biggest name in wrestling, and hired David Taylor. And you have been covering this and an integral part. So this is something that I've been very excited to talk to you about. What's your general thoughts? And I know you were involved. All the players. You have personal relationships. How would you put this in a nutshell? And what's your opinion on it?
It's huge, honestly. Oklahoma State going outside and getting somebody who's not an alumni as their next head coach, who is bringing in a guy who wrestled at Iowa, and he's bringing in Jimmy Kennedy, who's his brother-in-law as well, who, is also a collegiate. Like, it's a hodgepodge of great wrestlers that are now going to be coaches at Oklahoma State. It's a very big deal, because when you look at the years of John Smith, there was a ton of dominance. They have the most NCAA championships. They had, before Penn State was putting 5 guys in the finals and winning titles,
Jesus.
Oklahoma State was doing it. Oklahoma State had 5 champions in 1 year, right? So, and now those guys are all coaches. That's Pendleton, that's Espo, like that's Mako, like all those guys, are now NCAA. Yeah. They're all now coaches. Pendleton being a head coach at Oregon State. Espo is now the associate head coach at NC State. Mako has, I believe, a club in Florida.
Yeah.
So like, this was monumental. What it said for me was that they needed a change of direction. And what we've seen over the last couple of years is that Penn State has a formula of what they do. And what better way of pulling that formula into an already championship program in Oklahoma State than to go get one of the guys that was part of the start of that saw that from its infancy and has been in the room and has trained with those guys until literally last year, where they broke the points record and had 2 4-time NCAA champions crowned in the same year. Right. So that's what it said to me, and there was a number of guys that were part of that mix. Oklahoma State took 2 shots at getting somebody from Penn State. One guy was Casey Cunningham, who is an assistant coach at Penn State. He was one of the other phone calls that was made, and was supposedly in the mix. David Taylor became the head coach ultimately, but they didn't know that he was even a guy that was an option, because as John retires, the following week is the Olympic trials, so that entire week, a lot of the talk was nothing but Coleman Scott is the next guy that is going to be the head coach at Oklahoma State. And that's what everybody was thinking, down to the part where I was talking with Coleman and his wife about it. Like, hey, like, do you guys feel like you have the best shot to get this? And they obviously did. They had moved from North Carolina, where Coleman was the head coach, to go to Oklahoma State and become the associate head coach, to hopefully become that next guy when John retired. And no one knew, including John, I don't think, knew that it was going to be one more year and then he was ready to retire. I think he got to the end of the season and was like, all right, now I'm ready, and that's how it went. So, David Taylor now being the guy, and this being his first time as a head coach, first time as a collegiate coach, period. Hasn't been on staff anywhere, has been nothing but I shouldn't say nothing but has been a competitor all his life, to now step into, very big shoes to fill. And I would say kind of two very big pairs of shoes to fill, because he's coming behind John Smith, but he's leaving Cale Sanderson's program. And right now, everybody expects him to be Cale 2.0. And I want David Taylor to be David Taylor, right? Like, he is ultra dynamic scorer, amazing wrestler. And if he brings that same sort of mentality, obviously there's going to be an overlap between Penn State and Oklahoma State. There's no way around it. But I think what Oklahoma State was looking for, which is what John brought to Oklahoma State in the first place, was that big name notoriety. Because at the time that John became the head coach, he was big name notoriety, right? He was multiple time world and Olympic champion. And the people and the kids that he was recruiting had just watched him compete.
Yes.
And he spent 1 year, I believe, as an assistant before becoming the head coach. Cale was an assistant at Iowa State before taking over at Iowa State, then going to Penn State. But John had that big name notoriety. So when he walked into your living room, just like when Cale Sanderson walked into David Taylor's living room, it was like the guy that I have a poster of on my wall is sitting in front of me and wants me on his team. So that was the same dynamic that you saw with hiring David Taylor at Oklahoma State. These kids have grown up watching David Taylor. We grew up watching Cale Sanderson, watching John Smith.
Yeah.
Right. Watching, Kerry McCoy. We grew up watching those guys. So it's a generational thing. Coleman Scott is he's an awesome person. Love him to death.
Amazing
and
person.
He would have been a great coach as well. But I think when they were looking at it, they're saying David Taylor is a name that's going to really shake things up. It's going to change how things are done around here. He's an Olympic champion. We want to essentially replace our Olympic champion, our Olympic and world champion, with another Olympic and world champion, and not only that, they want a little piece of that championship mentality that's been happening in State College. So they're going to bring in a guy like David Taylor. Right. And there was a number of times, and it was kind of reported that Taylor turned down the job a couple of times, but they were so gung-ho, and they had, the CEO of Paycom, what's his name? Hutchison, I believe it is, or Richardson.
Very rich guy, son?
Yeah, Chad Very Richardson, I guess is what his name is. And he came in and really helped push the envelope to get David Taylor. And David said today during his press conference, he wanted the right program, the right situation with the right resources, and a program that could win. And there's really, and I'm not putting down any other team, because, NC State does very, very well. Virginia Tech did amazing job this past year. Michigan as well. But when you look at the big three, it's Penn State, it's Oklahoma State, and it's Iowa. And those were the three jobs that I think that David Taylor would even really consider at this point, especially coming off a loss at the Olympic trials where he didn't make another Olympic team. So, the formula was there. They dedicated the resources to what he wanted, and they got their big, tremendous splash hire. I mean, you mentioned what things look like on social media when Oklahoma State announced this. Mind you, we were actually recording our show at the time that the news was breaking. So the show started with us asking, what the hell's going on in Oklahoma State? And by the end of the show, we were like, oh shit, it's David Taylor. Right. And we had obviously heard about that, but they made the announcement at 9:30, 10 o'clock at night, Central Time, 11 o'clock at night, Eastern Time. Right. Like, it was late. That doesn't really come. That doesn't really happen. Right. So, and that one post by the next day was viewed 1 million times. That's crazy. Kind of unheard of in the wrestling world.
That is
right? Like,
insane.
That doesn't really happen. That's just on Twitter, right? Like, Twitter had 1 million views of the post announcing David Taylor. So this is a tremendous hire. Honestly, it really is. And I feel bad for Coleman Scott, who really truly wanted the job. This is his dream job, but I feel very good for David Taylor being able to start off his career, right? Like those two things are very separate. I love Coleman, think he would have been great in the job, but I also feel like David Taylor can do a really great job as well.
So I've tried to explain, we have a large group text. Obviously, my son's wrestled. I'm a part of the wrestling community, but I tried to explain just the significance that this was. The only thing I could say to them and explain an analogy is, imagine LeBron retires this week, didn't make the championships, disappointed, he was going to make, and then says, I'm taking the Kentucky job next year. Zero coaching experience. No one, I mean, we all knew David Taylor was eventually going to coach, but this seemed like, was this a knee-jerk reaction? I mean, think about the chain of events. Zahid Valencia against Aaron Brooks.
Yeah.
If Zahid beats Aaron Brooks, does David Taylor beat Zahid, or is Zahid now representing? Does David Taylor take this job if he's in Paris in July?
I don't think anything changes. I think he still does. But I think the timeline of things changes, because I don't know if he's thinking about that, right? Because the only reason he's thinking about life after wrestling is because life after wrestling is now right here in front of him, right? That's the page he's on.
Yeah.
If he makes the team, I think it's still an option, but even Oklahoma State said that they didn't know David was an option until he was an option.
Yeah.
I think that while he still could have become the head coach at Oklahoma State, I don't know if he does right now, right? Like that's the hard part, because he's the way David is he's focused. He keeps the main thing, right? He may have M2 training center. He may have, all the cattle, and, he's got his farms and everything else in State College, but that's a blip on the radar for him, right? That's a means of getting my mind off of the competition, allowing my body to, to just relax, giving back to the sport with being a club coach at M2, having a hobby with, his couple heads of cattle and everything else.
8 chickens, a pig. He said it
right.
in the
Like he's got a farm now. Right. So but I think the opportunity presented itself because his career had come to an end. And he even said today that after winning in 2021, it was very hard for him to continue wrestling until 2024. But the only reason that he did was because it was only 3 years and not 4. That extra year really made a big difference. He's like, I can stick it out. I can take care of my body. I can do the things I need to do to make another team. And I feel like I have the fire to do it. He said the fire wasn't as hot, and it, ultimately ended up with him losing to Aaron Brooks, but he felt like he could still do it. So he went out and he tried to do it, right? Especially with him sitting in the finals. He didn't have to wrestle throughout the entire tournament because he was the returning gold medalist. So he sat in the finals. And you think, I can beat the guy that has been in the room, and he knows how good Aaron Brooks is, which is why they haven't trained together in years. They stopped training together, I believe, after the last Olympics, because Aaron was his training partner when they went to the last Olympics in Tokyo. But you'd feel like you can do it, right? And ultimately, he doesn't end up on the team. So I think it became an option then. So yeah, I think he probably still would have had coaching aspirations, but I don't think he's an option for Oklahoma State. So I may have contradicted myself, but like I honestly think like he still becomes a coach at some point, but he may become an assistant coach at Penn State instead of the head coach at Oklahoma State if he was to make the team.
Yeah.